Next up over here, we have our toolbar. This is all the tools that we can use in Photoshop. A tool is just something that you use, it basically shows up on your cursor, and it's just used to make adjustments on the actual image. We will go through it more in depth, tool by tool, of what they do as we use them. But before we get started, I just want you to be somewhat familiar with what each of these do. So the move tool right here, you can click on an object, move it around. This is basically the default cursor in Photoshop. Next, we'll go to the marquee tool. So right here, we have a couple different options. We're just going to talk about these top two right here. So we have the rectangular marquee tool and the elliptical marquee tool. So let's just select the elliptical marquee tool. Now, if I click and drag and then let go, I will have made a selection. Anytime in Photoshop you see this, it's called marching ants. This means this area of the photo is selected. So if I wanted to make a rectangular selection, just click here and go to the rectangular marquee tool. Now I can make a selection over here. If you click in a new area, it'll start making a new selection. The last selection will just be forgotten. Here is the lasso tool. This is another way to make selections, but instead of having it be a default shape like a square or an ellipse, you can do it freehand. So the lasso tool, you just click, drag wherever I want to make a selection, and then when you let go, it'll automatically snap to where you started, and it's made a selection here. If you have a selection and you want to deselect, you can go to select, deselect like that. Or if I've made a selection here and I want to deselect it, I can just click Control D and it'll deselect, and then I can start over. That's the lasso tool. If I wanted to switch to this, the polygonal lasso tool, just click here, and now I can click a point, click another point, click another point, click another point, and then when I get close to that first point, the cursor will change and automatically close my selection. Now it's just a different way of making a selection. I'm going to deselect by clicking Control D. The next option is the magnetic lasso tool. This is just a different way to make a freehand selection, but it's going to try to click to the nearest object in the screen. This is just Photoshop being super smart. So let's zoom in here. You can click zoom. This is the zoom tool down here, or just push Z and then click and drag, or you can use your scroll wheel to just click and drag to where you want to be. So let's say I wanted to make a selection around these mountains. I can click the magnetic lasso tool, and then I'll click down here and start moving without letting go of my cursor, so I'm still holding down the click, moving along the edge here. It's just going to snap this selection as I move it to the mountain. And it's doing a pretty good job of guessing where that is. So even like if I go up a little bit or down a little bit, it's going to try to stick right to that edge. And then if I wanted to just close that selection, I can drag it. And then if I get to that first one, the icon will change, let go, and it's made that selection. Really easy way to get precise. If I went to the lasso tool and I tried to do that same thing, it would be really difficult for me to get right on the edge of that. I'm doing this with my computer mouse, but still it's just difficult. Magnetic lasso tool is just going to snap it to the closest objects within your image. It'll do its best to try. The magic wand tool is another selection tool. You can select it by going to W, and this will select an area, so you only have to click once to use this tool, and it'll select all the pixels around it that kind of match it. So if I wanted to select the mountain, I could click here, and it has just automatically selected the pixels that it thinks matches most closely in the image to the spot where I clicked, which is right here. Fun thing I can do with this, so you see how here, if I zoom in, this is the selected area, and these little circles show spots that aren't selected. If I clicked Shift and select, I can add those areas to my selection. If I wanted to take away spots of my selection, I could Alt click, and you see how there's a little subtract sign. So when I clicked Shift, there's a plus sign. When I hold down Alt, there's a negative sign. If I wanted to take away areas of this selection, I could just like click there, and now it took away stuff like that. This looks terrible because obviously that's not how I would actually use it. So that is the magic wand tool. If I click here, I can go to the quick selection tool, and this you click and drag across the area that you want to select. So again, I want to try selecting this mountain. So I clicked here on the mountain, drag it across, and it'll just do its best to try to guess where that is. When I let go, it'll analyze the areas that I've selected and then try to make it better. If I wanted to add to my selection, I can just click inside of it and then keep dragging outward to select the entire mountain range of this image. And then let's say I didn't want to select the pole, but I want to keep going on this side. Just keep going, keep going, keep going. That's the quick selection tool. Again, I can click Shift with this tool, or you can change the options up here. But if I click Shift right now, it'll add to my selection. If I click Alt, it'll subtract from my selection as I move it. You have to hold Alt as you do this. So I have, this is my normal. If I wanted to add to it, click and drag, or I hold down Alt as I click and drag to subtract from my selection. You can't really see it right here, but if I increase my brush size, so I can do that by going to this little icon, drop down menu, and dragging up the size to something bigger. You can see a plus sign in there by default, or when I push down Alt, a minus sign. And then I subtract these areas from my image. So now I've selected what I want. That's the mountain range. Oh, I want to add this little area, so I can click and drag that. Perfect, that's my selection. I don't want to work with this, so Control D to deselect. Let's move on to the crop tool. This is one of the easiest tools to use, but has a cool feature that we'll talk about in a second. The crop tool just allows you to change the size of your image visually. So if I click and drag, I can drag it outward. I can click the corners to just size it down that way. Or if I select my image behind here, I can drag around my image to show what parts I want to fit. So let's say I just wanted to get a really tight shot of that area. But I actually want it to come over a little bit to this side and put that pole right in the middle. There. And now to accept the changes, I can either click this check mark or just push enter and it'll accept that, and that is the new size of my image. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to click Control Z to undo. An important thing to know about the crop tool is you can select what size you want your image to be or what ratios you want it to be. So if I was going to post something on Instagram and I want it to be a perfect square, I can click 1 by 1 and it'll make sure that my image is a perfect square. And even if I go to change it up or down, it'll keep it at that size. If I wanted to put it in a frame and I wanted to put it in a nice 8 by 10 frame, I can click 8 by 10 from that drop down and size it however I want, push enter, and now I have a perfect 8 by 10 image. I'm gonna undo that because I want to show you something else we can do. So right now we have the 8 by 10 ratio. It's also 4 by 5. If I click these arrows in between, it'll just reverse. So instead of being 4 by 5, it'll be 5 by 4 if I wanted a landscape image. Or I could go in here and I could type in whatever number I wanted. So let's say I know that the frame I'm using is 17 inches by 11 inches. Just put in 17 by 11, that's the size, and then I want to scale it down a little bit, so I do that. It's going to fit perfectly into that 17 by 11 frame. And we'll go to the next tool, which is the eyedropper tool. The eyedropper tool is useful for selecting a color out of your image. Let's say I wanted to select the color of this awesome green grass. All I have to do is take my eyedropper tool and click down here. If I click and don't let go, so I'm holding down the click right now, I can see in this top area of this circle shows what color I'm selecting. The bottom area shows what color I had selected before. So let's say I want that green, looks great, let go, and now that green is selected down here. These are my swatches. This shows my foreground color and my background selected color. You can also change these by clicking and then adjusting the color. Or if you've clicked on it and you're in your color picker, you can move your mouse out of it and it'll just automatically change it to the eyedropper tool, and now that color is selected. Let's say I made some changes to this, so I changed it to that blue, but I want to switch it. I want the blue to be the background color. I can just click this little double arrow right here, and now those are switched. Or I could just click X and it'll automatically switch them back and forth. If I want to undo those changes and I just want to set it back to the default, which is black as the foreground and white as the background, I can click on this little icon and it'll change it back to black and white. Or say I make some changes again. If I had it changed but I want to change it back, I can just select D and it'll do the same thing as clicking on here. Click D on my keyboard. Now it's back to black and white. The next tool we want to talk about is this spot healing brush tool. So if I click on this and then I go to my image, you can see here that I'm an idiot and I didn't clean my sensor before we went out and shot against the really bright sky. So I have all these little specks on my sensor for my camera. Luckily, Photoshop is awesome. It gives me a really easy way to clean those up, which is the spot healing brush tool. All I have to do is click over the spot and I can drag it out to make sure I cover all of that spot, let go, and Photoshop will automatically just match it with the surrounding colors. If I want to change my size of the tool, I can come up here and change size. Now I can just click over these and Photoshop will do its best to fill it in with just the regular blue that we see behind it. Super useful tool. If I want it to be more precise, I don't want it to do it automatically because sometimes Photoshop can make mistakes. Let's look down here. So let's say I wanted to get rid of this post right here, and I automatically do that. It'll kind of do it, but you can see it didn't do it perfectly. Okay, it did a pretty dang good job. But another option I can do is the healing brush tool. So instead of spot healing brush tool, it's the healing brush tool. I can change the size again to make it a little bigger. That's too big, let's go there. Now what I do is, instead of doing it automatically, like if I try to click right now, it'll say I can't. I have to define a source point to use. So you do that by Alt clicking. So hold down Alt, click down where you want it to sample from. So I want it to sample from here. Now what I do is it brings this area over it, and as I click, you can see where it's sampling from. Now if I drag down, I'm just gonna paint the area of the image that I had just clicked over onto this. And now look, that post is gone. It's not perfect, but really quick way to do that. The next tool we're gonna learn about is the brush tool. It is so important because we use this in every step of composite photography. Let's go to the brush tool. You can see the size of my brush right here. It's that little circle. If I wanna change it, I can click the bracket key, go up, and look, you can see the changes happening up here. I could just change this and slide it around, but I don't want to. I want to not have to deal with that, so I can do that. And now if I click and paint, that's its size. If I bring it down, now that's the size of the brush. If I want to change the hardness of the brush, I could also come here and adjust the hardness. This just makes it so, like you can see here, this adjusts the edges. So this is a really clear brush, 100% hardness. If I bring it to 0% hardness, it'll feather it out from that middle. Look at that. Super nice. When you are using the brush, to be able to adjust that, it's important. And that's something you'll need to know later on. We don't use any of the other tools in this course that are featured under here. They're not super useful. Clone stamp tool is super useful. It's basically like the spot healing brush tool, except for instead of automatically trying to blend it in, it'll just paint directly over with whatever you had selected. So let's select the blue sky, and I want to paint away these clouds. Just paint over that, and oh, now I messed that up, so I want to paint over these dots. Using the clone stamp tool, I can do that really easily. The next tool is the eraser tool. This isn't something we use very often because if you make a change with the eraser tool, you can't really undo it if later on you were like, oh, I didn't want to erase that part, I want it back. There's another way we can do that using layer masks, and we'll cover that in depth later on. But real quick, the eraser tool does exactly what you think. It just erases selections of your image. Let's go to the paint bucket tool right here. If I wanted to cover the entire image with one color, so I want to cover it with black, just click, and it'll automatically try to fill in these areas with paint bucket tool. This is like exactly like the paint bucket tool on Microsoft Paint, if you've ever used that. The next tool we're going to talk about is the blur tool. The blur tool is fairly straightforward. So if I have my image selected and I want to blur out a section, I can just click on it and look, it makes it super blurry. I can adjust how blurry it's going to make it by going up here in the strength and bring this down. So if I bring it down low to 23, it'll just do it, and the more and more I go over it, the more it'll blur it, but won't do it as quickly. Fun tip is, in any of these settings where you can adjust things, like here, the opacity of this layer, I could bring it down. You can click on the word and drag to the side and adjust the percentage. So strength here, 23%. I can drag it down instead of having to open down this arrow and then click. I could just do that. If I wanted to, I could even click, let's say I want 50% strength. If I push 5 on my keyboard, it'll go automatically to 50. If I push 1, it'll go to 10. If I wanted something specific like 27, just push 27 real quick and it'll go to 27. If you want it to be at 100, push 0. Great, that's the blur tool. Now the next tool is the sharpen tool, and that's really similar. So I want to up the size of this brush, so I'm going to do my brackets. Now, this will just sharpen an area of the image, and the more you go over it, the sharper it'll be. Next tool is the smudge tool. This takes an area of the image and kind of drags it around. So if I click here and drag this way, it'll just kind of smudge everything together. It's kind of like painting. If this was all just a wet canvas and you put a brush here and dragged it, it just kind of like drags it around. There are some uses for this tool, but not a ton. It's not one of my favorites. The next section, the dodge, burn, and sponge tools are some of my favorites, especially dodge and burn. The dodge tool makes areas of your image lighter. So let's say I see the shadow here. I want to kind of make it a little lighter, so I'll bring my brush size down. If I click over this, it'll just lighten that. The exposure is low, so if I want to bring it up, let's just bring it up to 100 so you can see really easily. Look how much lighter that is now. Again. Great, and now I can just lighten areas of my image. Or I could go to the burn tool, which is the exact opposite. It just darkens areas of my image. So if I go over this, I'm going to bring the exposure up. I want to add 100, so I just press 0. Bam. Darkens this area of the image. Don't you love my beautiful masterpiece right now? It's looking great. The next tool, the sponge tool, can basically think of it as a sponge sucking out color. It'll desaturate areas of your image. Let's say this sky looks great, but I want it to be gray because I'm pretty glum. Just click here, and as I keep going, it just desaturates this area of the image. It's really useful if you have specific little areas that you want to adjust without making big adjustments to your whole image. So if I wanted to, let's say, let's say this is so bright that I want to desaturate it, right? Because I made a mistake. So if I just take out the color, it won't look like neon green on there anymore. So now it doesn't look as crazy. Look at that. You can also change the mode. So that was desaturate. Saturate, think of it as a full sponge full of color, and you're just going to add more color. So now I want to change this. This is just going to bring up the saturation. Saturation just means how much color is in your color. So this is a really colorful green. As I keep going, it's just going to get crazier and crazier. This area is a lot more saturated than this area. Okay, next is the pen tool. The pen tool is useful because you can do so many things with it, and we are going to have a whole area dedicated to that. We're not going to use it quite yet because it's one of the more difficult tools to get to understand how to use. But once you do, it basically brings a composite photographer from here to here because you can make such specific adjustments. But the pen tool allows you to go back later and change them. Very helpful. The next tool is the type tool. We're not going to use this at all in this course because this is mostly like for graphic design and stuff like that. In photography, we won't have much of a use for it. But if I click here with the type tool and then I start typing, it'll just put letters on. So that was a really bad example. Let's bring the text size down and then let's change the color to this bright red so it's really easy to see. Gibson Rocks. Here, zoom out, we can see that better. And look, it has a nice little Gibson Rocks. Push check mark to select that and then click that there. Look, beautiful art. If you're a graphic designer, the type tool would be super useful, but as photographers, not the most important thing. The next tool is we can draw some different shapes on our screen. We have all these different options. So if I wanted to add a circle to my image, This again is probably more of a graphic design thing, and we're not going to use this in this course. But if I wanted to draw an ellipse, I have my red selected here, drag it out, and look, I have a red circle. If I wanted to do a rectangle, drag a rectangle. Look at that. Next up, we're going to use the hand tool. The hand tool is super useful. So let's say I'm working on my image and I'm zoomed in here, and I've been using these sliders on the sides to adjust where I'm looking. I can just use the hand tool and click and drag. It doesn't change anything about my image. It's just a tool for adjusting how I see it. So I can adjust this. I just want to focus on this area right here. Perfect. A useful tip about the hand tool, this applies to all the tools, but I especially use it for this one. So the hotkey for this is H. So if I click H, switch this to my hand tool, and I can use it. Then I can click V and go back to my cursor. But if I was just doing quick adjustments and I didn't want to have to click it twice, I can just hold down H, change where I'm looking, and then bam, let go, and I'll just zoom back into there. This works for everything. Let's say I'm using my paintbrush tool right here, and I want to quickly erase something. I can hold down E, erase that, let go of E, and it'll go right back to my brush tool, and then I can keep painting. So it's basically just a quick little shortcut to switch between tools temporarily while you're holding it down. The last thing is the magnifying glass. We already talked about that, but if you click on it, and the shortcut is Z. I use this one all the time. Click, drag outward, it'll zoom out. Click, drag inward, I guess the left and right. So drag to the left, it'll zoom out. Drag to the right, it'll zoom in. Again, you can also scroll. So that's our toolbar. Down here we have our color swatches that we talked about. It just shows what color is selected when we do all these adjustments. So that applies mostly to like the paint tool, the shape tools, that kind of stuff. Down here is a useful little thing. This shows our screen modes. So this is just the default one that we're on right now. It just looks like a normal program open. If I wanted to change this, I could go full screen. And great, now Photoshop is full screen on my monitor. If I wanted to show full screen just the image without all of the extra menus, panels, and toolbar and everything, I just go like this, and now I have full screen mode. To change between screen modes, just push down F, and look, it'll bring me back. F, F. So that cycles between the three. Sometimes if you get stuck on this, like you press F by accident and it goes to full screen, and you're like, wait, where's all my stuff? I'm freaking out, can't do anything. Just push F, and it'll bring you right back. I do that by accident all the time. Okay, so that's our toolbar. The last tip is, look at this little arrow here. If I click on that, it'll make it a double column. That's just in case, like if I was bringing this out here and I just wanted it to be a lot smaller, I could do that, or here, just depending on how I wanted it to fit on my screen. I just leave it at the default single column because that's what I'm used to, but it doesn't really matter.